The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. For 3 straight days, it had been screaming, trying to claw its way into Jackson Shepherd's tiny log cabin. Inside, the world felt like it had already ended, buried under a mountain of snow with a dying fire and a dying daughter. Her name was Abigail, 3 months old, and her cries weren't even cries anymore. They were whispers, tiny, ragged breaths of pain that were getting fainter and fainter. Jackson knelt beside her cradle, a heavy rifle lying across his lap. The steel was cold, just like the dead thing in his chest where his faith used to be. He wasn't a man who prayed anymore. God had left him long ago, out on some bloody battlefield soaked in mud and misery. But tonight, he was close to begging. He was staring at his daughter's pale face, trying to will her to take one more breath, when he saw it. A shape in the storm. Through the frosted glass, a dark smudge moved against the impossible, swirling white. It stumbled. It fell to its knees. Then, impossibly, it got back up and kept coming, straight for his door. Out here, miles from the nearest town, in a blizzard that had already killed hardened cattle and stranded seasoned travelers. This wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't help. This was trouble. His thumb found the hammer of the rifle. He pulled it back, and the soft click was the loudest sound in the world. The knock on the door was so faint he almost missed it, almost dismissed it as the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, 3 sharp raps against the wood. Desperate. Jackson laid his daughter gently in her cradle and moved to the door, the rifle held ready. He didn't call out. He didn't ask who was there. He just slid the heavy bar and pulled the door inward. A blast of ice and snow hit him in the face, blinding him for a second. When his vision cleared, he saw a figure huddled on his doorstep, covered from head to toe in a thick, snow-crusted cloak. "Please," a voice whispered, thin and cracked. "Shelter." It was a woman. Jackson hesitated for a heartbeat. In this part of Wyoming, a lone woman in a storm was a bad sign. It meant she was running from something, or luring someone to something worse. But then Abby let out another one of those weak, heartbreaking whimpers from the cradle. He stepped aside. The woman staggered into the room, bringing the bitter cold with her. She leaned against the door frame for a moment, catching her breath, before she slowly lowered her hood. The firelight flickered across a young face, maybe 30, pale and drawn. Her lips were cracked and blue, and there were dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. She looked like she'd been through a war of her own. "Eleanora Wells," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But folks call me Nora." Jackson didn't offer his own name. He just nodded toward the fire. "What brings you out in this?" She unwound a frozen scarf from her neck, her hands trembling. "Stage left me in Riverton before the storm got bad. Boarding house was full. I was trying to get to my cousin's place in Montana." She glanced around the small cabin, her eyes taking in the sparse furniture, the single bed, the cradle. Her gaze stopped on the cradle. "I've been walking since yesterday," she said, but her voice trailed off. Her attention was completely fixed on the tiny sounds coming from the pinewood box. Just then, Abby let out a piercing cry, a sound of pure, raw hunger that seemed too big for her tiny body. Nora's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes widening. "You have a child?" she asked, taking a half-step forward. Jackson instinctively moved to block her path. "My daughter," he said, his voice hard. "Abigail." Abby cried again, weaker this time, and the sound twisted something in Jackson's gut. He'd been so focused on the stranger, he'd almost forgotten the real threat was inside his own cabin. The woman, Nora, stood frozen. Her face was a mask of emotions he couldn't decipher. Pain, yes, but something else too. Recognition, a deep, hollow longing. Her hand went to her own chest, pressing against the wet fabric of her blouse. Jackson saw it then. Dark stains spreading across the material. "How old is she?" Nora asked, her voice hushed, almost reverent. 3 months, Jackson said, his suspicion warring with a sudden, inexplicable pity. "Her mother. She's gone." Nora's breath hitched, She took another step, her eyes never leaving the crying infant. 8 weeks ago, she said, and her voice cracked wide open. I had a son. He lived for 6 days. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and terrible. Jackson didn't know what to say. He'd heard countless stories of loss from his pulpit, but this felt different. This was fresh. This was a wound still bleeding. He scooped Abby from her cradle, trying to soothe her with a gentle rocking motion, but her cries only grew more frantic. I'm sorry, he mumbled, the words feeling useless. Nora wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was locked on Abby, her expression a mix of her own agony and something else he was just beginning to understand. Determination. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Mr. Shepherd, she said, her voice suddenly steady, your daughter is hungry. Jackson felt a flash of anger. I know that, he snapped. I've tried everything. Goat's milk, sugar water, teas. She won't take it. Nora's eyes were filled with a strange light. She needs milk, she said simply. Real milk. Before Jackson could process what she meant, her hands went to the buttons of her cloak. She unfastened it, letting it fall to the floor. Then she started on the buttons of her blouse. The dark, wet stains were larger now, impossible to ignore. My body, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. It doesn't know he's gone. The milk. It still comes. Understanding crashed over Jackson like a physical blow. He stared at her, at the spreading stains, his mind refusing to believe it. A stranger, a woman appearing from a deadly storm, offering the one thing in the world he couldn't provide, the one thing his daughter needed to live. You could feed her? He whispered, the words barely audible. Nora nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. If you'll let me, please. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. It was impossible. A prayer he hadn't even dared to speak, answered in the most unbelievable way. Abby let out another weak cry, a sound that felt like a final plea, and the decision made itself. Yes, he said, his voice hoarse. Please. Nora moved toward him, her arms outstretched. For a split second he hesitated, this stranger taking his child, but then he looked down at Abby's face, pinched with hunger, and he placed his daughter into her waiting arms. He turned away, busying himself with the fire, giving her privacy. He heard the rustle of clothing, a soft sigh, and then silence. The crying stopped, completely. It's all right, Nora's voice came, soft and gentle. You can look. He turned. She was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, Abby cradled in her arms, nursing peacefully. The baby's tiny hand was pressed against Nora's skin, her little body finally still. For the first time in weeks, his daughter wasn't crying. Jackson felt something inside him shatter, a wave of relief so powerful it buckled his knees. He sank to the floor by the hearth, watching his daughter's face, the furrowed brow now smooth with contentment. He couldn't speak. He could only watch as silent tears streamed down Nora's face, her own grief finding a strange, temporary comfort in giving life to another's child. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had taken root. When Jackson woke, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the frosted window, painting the cabin floor in gold. He was on the floor by the hearth, a blanket thrown over him. He sat up, his mind racing, trying to place the dream. The storm, the knock, the woman. But it wasn't a dream. Nora was still in the rocking chair, Abby asleep in her arms. She was looking out the window at the new, white world. She slept for 2 hours straight, Nora said softly, without turning. A deep, peaceful sleep. Jackson got to his feet, his body stiff and sore. He walked over, hardly daring to believe the change in his daughter. Her cheeks had a touch of color, her breathing was deep and even. The tiny, pained lines around her mouth were gone. It's a miracle, he whispered. Nora finally turned to look at him, a small, sad smile on her lips. I think, she said, her gaze dropping to the sleeping baby. We were a miracle for each other. An awkward silence settled between them. They were strangers, bound by the most intimate of acts, forced together by grief and desperation. "I need to check the sheep," Jackson said, just to have something to say. "Will you be all right?" Nora nodded. "We'll be fine." Outside, the world was blindingly white and silent. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sculpted by the wind. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. He trudged to the barn, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Who was this woman? How long could she stay? And what in God's name would happen to Abby when she left? When he returned to the cabin an hour later, he stopped dead in the doorway. Nora had placed Abby back in the cradle and was moving around his kitchen as if she'd lived there her whole life. She'd found his meager supplies and had a pot of cornmeal mush bubbling over the fire. "I hope you don't mind," she said, noticing him. "I figured you'd be hungry." They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of the flames. Jackson kept stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile the desperate refugee from the night before with the calm, capable woman sitting across from him. "The storm's over," he said finally. "The stage should be running in a few days. I can take you into town." Nora put down her spoon. Her eyes met his, direct and unflinching. "And what happens to Abigail then?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. He had no answer that didn't end with his daughter starving again. "I don't know," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. Nora looked away, out the window. "My cousin in Montana," she said carefully. "She's not expecting me. I could stay. For a while. Until you find another solution." Relief washed over Jackson so intensely he had to grip the table to keep his hands from shaking. "I'd be grateful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you know." Nora gave a single decisive nod. "Then it's settled. I'll stay until spring." The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. Nora took over Abby's care completely, her movements practiced and gentle. Jackson found himself spending more and more time out in the barn, not just because of the work, but because the cabin no longer felt like his own. It was warmer, cleaner, but it was filled with the presence of this woman he barely knew. He built her a small sleeping platform in the corner, giving her a space of her own. He didn't say much about it, and neither did she, but that night, lying in his own bed, he was acutely aware of her soft breathing from across the room. It had been so long since he hadn't been completely alone. He was grateful, he realized, grateful for more than just the milk she provided. Her quiet presence had pushed back the crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion since Sarah's death. The thought made him uneasy. It felt like a betrayal. On the fifth day, another knock came at the door. It was Reverend Thomas Porter, the man who had taken Jackson's place at the church. He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, and his eyes immediately landed on Nora, sitting with Abby by the fire. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a cold, calculating look. "Mrs. Wells," he said, his voice dripping with false surprise. "What a coincidence to find you here." Nora went pale, her arms tightening around Abby. "Reverend Porter," she whispered. Jackson looked between them. "You know each other?" "We have mutual acquaintances," Porter said smoothly, his eyes never leaving Nora. "Mrs. Wells has quite the reputation in Riverton." The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. It was a threat. Jackson felt a surge of protectiveness. "Mrs. Wells was caught in the storm," he said, his voice low. "She's helping with Abigail." Porter's gaze was sharp. "How very convenient." He turned to Jackson, lowering his voice. "Do you have any idea who you've let into your home, Shepard? This woman. People talk. It would be wise to be cautious." "My daughter is alive because of her," Jackson said, his voice hard. "That's all the caution I need." Porter sighed, a theatrical sound of pastoral concern. He raised his voice so Nora could hear. "I trust you'll remember your situation, Mrs. Wells. Discretion is always appreciated. When the Reverend left, the cabin felt cold again. "How do you know him?" Jackson asked. Nora stared down at Abby, her face a closed book. "He has influence in Riverton. He knew my husband." "What did he mean?" "About your reputation." Nora's shoulders stiffened. "It's nothing. It's in the past." Jackson wanted to push, but the look on her face, a mix of fear and defiance, stopped him. Whatever secrets she was keeping, she was holding them close. And as he watched her gently rock his daughter, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. Who was this woman really? What kind of trouble had followed her out of that storm and right to his door? The town of Pine Valley was small, and secrets didn't stay secret for long. Whispers about the woman at the Shepherd homestead spread faster than a prairie fire. She'd just appeared out of the blizzard. The Reverend knew her from Riverton, and he wasn't saying how. It wasn't decent. A man not even 6 months a widower, living with an unmarried woman. Nora felt the stares every time she had to go into town for supplies. Women would pull their children closer. Men would watch her with a look she knew all too well. The talk got back to her in broken pieces, overheard conversations that stopped the moment she came near. One afternoon, she returned to the cabin, her face tight and pale. "They talk," she said, her back to Jackson as she put away the flour and salt. "About us." Jackson didn't look up from the harness he was mending. "Let them talk." "Not like this." She turned to face him, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and hurt. "They look at me like I'm soiled. And it's affecting you. You're standing here." She took a shaky breath. "Maybe I should go. I could find a room in town. I could still come and feed Abby." "No," Jackson said, the word sharper than he intended. He stood up, the harness falling from his hands. "You're not going anywhere because of some ignorant gossip." Her resolve seemed to crumble. "There's something you need to know," she whispered, sinking into the rocking chair. "About my husband, Martin. He didn't die in a mining accident." Jackson waited, his heart starting to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "He died in our home," she said, her eyes fixed on some distant, terrible memory. "He was a violent man, Jackson, for years. It started with words then. It got worse." She looked up, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "The night he died, he'd been drinking. He found out I was planning to leave him to take the baby somewhere safe. He came at me. He said he would kill us both." She choked back a sob. "There was a struggle. A knife. He fell on it, Jackson. His own knife." Her story tumbled out, a torrent of fear and pain. She hadn't waited for help. She just grabbed what little money she had and ran. Fled into the night, into the coming storm. "Does Porter know this?" Jackson asked, his mind racing. "He knows there were rumors," she said. "Martin was an elder in his church. Men like that, they protect their own. Porter thinks I killed him. He thinks I'm a murderer." The ugly word hung in the small cabin. Jackson looked at this woman who had shown him nothing but kindness, who had saved his daughter when he was ready to give up all hope. He looked at her tear-streaked face, at the terror in her eyes. "Did you?" he asked, his voice quiet. Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw not guilt, but a profound and weary sadness. "I didn't try to save him," she whispered. "When he fell, I could have tried to help, but I didn't. I just ran." The honesty of her confession struck him more than any denial could have. This wasn't the confession of a killer. It was the confession of a survivor. "You saved my daughter," he said, his voice low and intense. "Whatever happened before you came here, that's the only truth that matters to me. This is your home now, Nora, for as long as you need it." But even as he said the words, a cold dread settled over him. Porter wasn't a man to let things go, and Riverton wasn't that far away. The past wasn't buried. It was just waiting. Spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the valley green. A different kind of thaw was happening inside the cabin, too. The awkwardness between Jackson and Nora slowly melted away, replaced by a quiet companionship. They talked more, sharing stories of the lives they'd lived before grief had shattered them. He told her about Sarah, about his fractured faith. She told him about her son, Thomas, and the 6 short days she'd had with him. They were 2 broken people finding solace in each other's presence, but their fragile peace was about to be broken. One morning, a rider appeared on the path. It wasn't a neighbor. Jackson recognized the badge from 50 yards away. It was Frank Donovan, the sheriff of Riverton. Jackson's blood ran cold. He met the sheriff in the yard, his body tense. "Looking for a woman," Donovan said, his eyes missing nothing. "Eleanora Wells. Word is she came this way." Jackson's mind raced. He could lie. He could deny everything. But lies had a way of unraveling in a town this small. "She's wanted for questioning," Donovan continued, his gaze fixed on Jackson, "about the death of her husband." "What will happen to her?" Jackson asked, his voice tight. "Depends on what she has to say," the sheriff replied. "Martin Wells had a reputation. I'm not looking to hang a woman for defending herself, but I need to hear her side of it." Jackson made a decision. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but he had to take it. For Abby, for Nora. "I haven't seen anyone by that name," he said, the lie feeling heavy and clumsy on his tongue. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He knew. Jackson could see it. He knew he was lying. "I'll be in town for a few days," Donovan said, swinging back onto his horse. "If you remember anything—" He paused, his gaze shifting to the cabin, where a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. "And Shepard," he added, his voice low. "Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime." Jackson watched him ride away, his heart pounding. He hurried back inside. Nora was standing by the window, her face as white as a ghost. "You heard?" She nodded, her arms wrapped around herself. "Why did you lie for me, Jackson? You could go to jail." "I know enough," he said, turning to face her. "I know you're not a murderer, and I know my daughter is alive because of you. That's enough." But it wasn't enough to stop the law. Donovan would be back. He wouldn't come alone next time. They were trapped. That night, after Nora and Abby were asleep, Jackson sat by the fire, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He couldn't let them take her. He couldn't lose her. Not now. He was starting to realize, with a shock that went clean through him, that his feelings for this woman went far beyond gratitude. The thought of her being gone, of the cabin returning to its cold silence, was unbearable. An idea started to form in his mind. A crazy, desperate plan. A way to protect her, to keep her safe, right under the sheriff's nose. It was a gamble that could destroy them both, but it was the only one he had. "We need to talk," Jackson said the next evening. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every sound from outside made them both jump. "Donovan will be back," he said, his hands flat on the table. "And he'll have a warrant." "I could leave," Nora said, her voice barely a whisper. "Tonight. I could run." "And go where?" Jackson shook his head. "He'd find you. There's another way. A way to give you legal protection. A way to stop the questions." Nora looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean?" Jackson took a deep breath. "Marriage," he said. The word dropped into the silence between them. "Marry me, Nora. If you're my wife, my legal wife, it changes everything. A husband can't be forced to testify against his wife. They can't just drag you away. It gives us time. It gives you protection." Nora stared at him, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life," he insisted. "It would be an arrangement. A marriage of convenience, for Abby's sake, for your safety." "To tie yourself to someone like me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone with a past that could ruin you?" "We all have pasts, Nora," he said, his voice softening. "Mine are just different from yours." He looked over at the cradle where Abby was sleeping soundly, a picture of health. "This isn't about replacing Sarah. It's about protecting what we have now. This family." Nora was silent for a long time, her gaze distant. Finally, she gave a single, small nod. "All right, Jackson," she said. "For Abby. I'll do it." The journey to town was a tense, silent affair. Every person they passed on the street stared. The whispers followed them like a cloud of insects. In the general store, the owner, Harold Miller, looked them up and down. "Heard the sheriff was in town," he said, his voice slick with insinuation. "Curious timing for a wedding, some might say." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Some might mind their own business," he said, his voice flat and cold. At the justice of the peace's office, they stood side by side, two strangers making the most sacred of vows for the most practical of reasons. When Justice Mills said, "You may kiss the bride," they both hesitated. Then Jackson leaned in and gently pressed his lips to hers. It was supposed to be a formality, a part of the act. But the moment their lips touched, something shifted. An unexpected warmth, a spark of connection that had nothing to do with convenience or protection. It was brief, fleeting, but it was there, and it left them both slightly breathless. As they stepped out into the afternoon sun, legally husband and wife, Jackson saw Sheriff Donovan standing on the boardwalk across the street. He was just watching them. He didn't move, he didn't gesture. He just tipped the brim of his hat, a silent acknowledgement that Jackson had made his move. The game had just escalated. Their new life as Mr. and Mrs. Shepherd was a strange dance of pretense and reality. They slept in separate beds. Their conversations were careful, but the shared responsibility for Abby, the quiet moments of companionship, began to build something real between them. The town watched them, waiting for the charade to fall apart, waiting for the sheriff to make his move. But the sheriff didn't come. Instead, Reverend Porter did. He arrived one spring morning with two other men from town, wealthy ranchers with hard faces. They didn't dismount. They sat on their horses in the yard like a small, self-righteous army. "Shepherd," Porter said, his voice cold. "We're here on a matter of public safety. Your wife." "If you have something to say, say it to me," Jackson said, planting his feet firmly in his own yard. "Sheriff Donovan has returned to Riverton," Porter announced, a triumphant glint in his eye. "He's coming back with a warrant for the arrest of Eleanora Wells for murder." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. "We are giving you a chance to do the right thing," Porter continued. "Send her back. Let her face justice. It will be better for everyone. The alternative could be unpleasant." The threat was clear. Jackson looked at the hard faces of the men with him, and he knew this wasn't just Porter's crusade anymore. He had turned the town against them. That night, the fear in the cabin was a living thing. "I have to go," Nora said, her voice shaking. "If I don't, they'll come for me. They'll hurt you, Jackson." "I won't let them take you," he said, his voice a low growl. "There has to be another way. We have to fight them." "How?" she cried. "With what? They have the whole town on their side." Jackson's mind was racing. Porter's hatred felt personal, deeper than just moral outrage. There was something else driving him. He remembered the wedding, the unexpected appearance of Margaret Stanley, the quiet widow who had stood up for them. "I know what it's like to be the subject of whispers," she had said. An idea began to form. "Margaret Stanley," he said. "She stood against Porter. She knows something." The next day, they rode to the Stanley farm. The widow met them in the yard, her face grim. "I knew you'd come," she said. Inside her neat, sparse home, she told them a story that made Jackson's blood run cold. 5 years ago, just after Porter had arrived in Pine Valley, Margaret's 17-year-old daughter, Ruth, had started helping at the church. She grew quiet, withdrawn, haunted. Then one morning, she was gone. She'd left a note saying she had brought shame on her family. "She was with child," Nora whispered. Margaret nodded, her face a mask of old pain. "I confronted Porter. He denied everything. He said Ruth was unstable, that she had a history of telling lies. He ruined her name in this town to protect himself. Porter wasn't just a zealot, he was a predator, and he was using the same tactics on Nora, discrediting her, turning the community against her. all to protect his own dark secrets. "He's afraid of you," Margaret said, her eyes fixed on Nora. "He sees a woman who escaped, who survived. You're a threat to the carefully constructed lie he's been living." As she spoke, they heard the sound of horses approaching. Fast. Jackson looked out the window. It was Porter and his men, and behind them, another rider. Sheriff Donovan. They were trapped. The trap was about to spring. Sheriff Donovan dismounted slowly, his face unreadable. Porter stepped forward, a triumphant sneer on his face. "It's over, Shepard. The sheriff has the warrant." Nora stepped out onto the porch, Abby in her arms. She stood beside Jackson, her face pale but her chin held high. "I'm here, Sheriff," she said. Donovan looked at Porter, then at Nora. "Actually, Reverend," he said, his voice calm and even, "I don't have a warrant for her arrest." A stunned silence fell over the yard. "What do you mean?" Porter sputtered. "I went to Riverton to investigate," Donovan said, "and I found some interesting things. For one, a neighbor of yours, Mrs. Wells, has finally decided to talk. She heard everything that night. She heard Martin Wells threaten to kill you and your unborn child. She corroborates your story of self-defense." Hope, fragile and bright, bloomed in Nora's eyes. But Donovan wasn't finished. "She also told me about another man who visited Martin that night. A man Martin was having financial disagreements with." The sheriff's gaze shifted, landing squarely on Reverend Porter. "It seems your time as treasurer at the church in Riverton was very profitable, Reverend. Funds went missing, and Martin Wells knew where they went. He was blackmailing you, wasn't he?" Porter's face went slack with shock. "That's a lie!" "Is it?" Donovan asked. "Because Martin's accounts show regular payments from an anonymous source, payments that stopped right before he died. And on the night he died, you were there. You argued. Did the argument get out of hand, Reverend? Did you go there to silence him for good?" The accusation was stunning. Porter, the man of God, was a thief, and maybe something much worse. His power, his moral authority, evaporated in an instant. The men with him backed away, their faces a mixture of confusion and disgust. Porter seemed to shrink before their eyes. Without a word, he turned his horse and fled, a disgraced coward. The case against Nora was closed. She was free. Truly free. The threat that had forced them together was gone. The journey back to the homestead was quiet. The marriage of convenience had served its purpose. Now, they had to decide what came next. Jackson pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. He turned to Nora. "When we did this," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "it was for protection. But for me, it's become more than that. I don't want you to stay because you feel you have to. I want you to stay because you want to." Nora looked at him, and the smile that spread across her face was like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. "Jackson," she said softly, "it became more than that for me a long time ago." He leaned across the seat and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of convenience or a kiss of relief. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a beginning. It was the kiss of a husband and wife who had found each other in the middle of a storm and built a home together. 3 years later, a small girl with dark curls chased a butterfly across the yard. Jackson watched her, a deep contentment settling in his bones. Nora came out onto the porch, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The life they had built was quiet, simple, and more precious than anything he had ever known. Porter was long gone, his name a cautionary tale. The town, humbled by its own judgment, had slowly begun to heal. They had even asked Jackson to return to the pulpit, but he had refused. His church was here, on this land, with his family. The past was not forgotten. The scars were still there, reminders of the pain they had both endured. But they were just that, scars. Proof that they had been wounded, but that they had healed. As the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of fire and gold, Jackson pulled his wife and daughter close. They had found their peace, not by running from the storm, but by facing it together. If you enjoyed this story of justice and new beginnings, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows.